Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the League of Women Voters webinar, How We Vote. Today we have our clerk recorder, Keaton Denlay, here to explain some of the ins and outs of, like it says, how we vote. I appreciate everyone coming here today. We no doubt will have some people come in a couple minutes late. That's fine. It's being recorded, so um, excuse me. If anybody wants to watch it afterward, see what they missed, that's perfectly fine. And people who weren't able to attend tonight can see it. The link will be up on our website. So a couple of housekeeping things before I turn it over to Keaton. Like I said, this is being recorded. Also, we don't have chat enabled, but we have Q&A enabled. And I've turned on the setting that allows everyone to see open questions. So you can look and see if you're typing in a question in Q&A, you can look and see if someone's already asked it so we don't get a bunch of duplicates. So what's going to happen is I'm going to let Keaton do his presentation and then we'll switch to questions. I'm going to give him the questions so he's not having to switch back and forth and keep an eye on the Q&A. So if everybody could put their questions in the Q&A as they occur to them, we'll take them after Keaton's done with the main part of his presentation. So, all right, on to you, Keaton.
Great. Well, thanks, Claire. Yeah, like she said, my name's Keaton Denlay. I'm the Registrar of Voters and Clerk Recorder for Butte County. Generally, the way I like to do these is kind of keep them pretty short on my end. I'll kind of give you guys some details, explain how elections are being run as far as the primary process. Presidential primaries are a little bit weird in that respect. But to build up to that, I kind of want to explain how elections have worked in the past, going all the way back to the U.S. Constitution, 1789, to kind of give people an idea of how we got to where we are, because election law can be a little bit convoluted. It can be a little bit confusing. And I think understanding why it is the way it is helps people understand and sort of remember what's in front of them when they see their ballots or they are receiving their voter information guides, that sort of thing. I do want to note too that this is sort of the first half of these sort of public workshops, if you will. This one being about how we vote as far as your experience and the mechanics of actually voting. And then we're going to follow this up on Thursday with an in-person event here at our office, 155 Nelson Avenue in Oroville, which is the Hall of Records. And that's going to be at 4 p.m. on, like I said, on Thursday. And that one's going to be about, the life of a ballot. What happens to your ballot after you mail it in, turn it in, drop it off in a drop box? How are election net results reported, that sort of thing. That one's going to be a lot more, hands-on, depending on the numbers. We can give a pretty comprehensive tour of our facility here as well. So if you want to join us for that one, please do. Like I said, 4 p.m. on Thursday. No sign up really required for that one, but space is limited. So if you are interested in coming, maybe come a few minutes early, make sure we get everybody who wants to be in the room for that one. So like Claire said, if you have any questions that come along, there is the Q&A function that's been enabled. So you can submit those there and I'll be happy to answer as many of those as you guys have as we get towards the end of our little presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is voting itself and how that function has evolved over the time from, like I said, the late 1700s. And when this process all started, states all have their own way of doing things. We do have a decentralized way of running elections. And from the beginning, it was sort of a free for all. There were party ballots where you would show up with a piece of paper that had all the candidates from your party of choice on there. You drop that in the box, and that blue or red ticket, whichever it was totaled up at the end of the day, right? The other form that was used early on is voice voting. I would butcher the Latin name for this, but it looks like viva voce. But basically live voice voting, where you had to be present, and when they called your name, you could say who you were voting for. So those are the two methods early on that were being used. And as you can imagine, that's not particularly accurate. There's not a whole lot of auditability or anything, accountability on the tail end of those. Just however many pieces of paper were in the box, that's what got counted. And whoever heard somebody say their vote, that's how those were counted as well. That was pretty much the way it was for quite some time. It wasn't really until we got to the Civil War that things started being changed, that people were reconsidering how that was being done. And part of the reason for that was members of the military. During the Civil War, obviously, they were not in their hometowns where they could go down to City Hall and cast their vote in person. They were off fighting a war for their side of the Civil War, and they were still going to be able to vote. So they would do that by mail. And that was really when vote by mail became an option. And you'll see that as a trend as we kind of move through some of these advancements. A lot of them are sort of, I guess, tested out, run as pilots with the military out of necessity. And then once they're really ironed out and they become like a secure, well thought out, refined process, then they get rolled out to the public at large. And vote by mail is the first example of that that we saw in the 1860s. The other big change in the late 1800s would be in 1888, Massachusetts became the first state to enact a law that required what we call an Australian ballot or a secret ballot statewide. They were the first state to do that in 1888. And basically what that means is they started using ballots like we know of ballots today, where you see your ballot has all of the candidates on it. You can vote for the candidate that you want, and that ballot's not tied to you in any way. You would walk into the polling booth. You have a blank ballot. It's not red or blue or some color that tells people how you're voting. You can vote it privately, and then you just put it in the box and nobody knows how you voted. And that was really the first big step towards modern elections in our country. And it's really a feature of our voter bill of rights now, especially in California, that your vote is private. And a lot of what we do is geared towards making sure that you are able to cast a ballot independently, privately, free of intimidation, whether it's from your employer. You know, back then they were worried about mob bosses and people getting abducted on the way to the polls if they weren't going to vote the way that the prevailing interest in the area wanted them to vote. So yeah, that's a really, really big and important part of modern American elections, is that every registered voter, everybody who's eligible to vote, is able to do so based on their own wishes for the benefit of themselves and those around them, instead of being coerced or intimidated or anything like that they were dealing with prior to that. And then from 1888, elections themselves, as far as the mechanisms, were unchanged for quite some time. Obviously, you had suffrage movement, you had the civil rights movement. So not downplaying those at all, but they didn't really change the mechanisms of voting and how voting worked. But they did obviously expand voting rights to many people, including people of color, women, obviously, and then 18-year-olds, 18, 19, 20-year-olds were fighting in foreign wars. It only made sense for them to be included in that as well. So for about the next 90, 100 years after 1888, that was kind of a big focus on expanding the right to vote, that franchise, and including as many people as possible. And that continued all the way up until that last amendment passed for that, which I believe was 1971. If there's any historical scholars in the room, they can correct me on that. But 18-year-olds gaining the right to vote in 1971. One other change that happened during that time frame was absentee voting. Previously, it had been something that was really reserved for the military, people with some sort of governmental reason for being away from home. But in 1962, California, the first general election in California was held where you had absentee voting. Absentee voting is very different from vote by mail voting that we have now, in that you had to justify it somehow. You had to have a doctor's note. You had to be in the hospital. A military assignment would be one of those things that would allow you to be qualify as absentee, but still be able to vote. And those votes were being cast through the mail. That first general election in 1962, only 2.6% of ballots in California were voted that way. So you can kind of get a feel for the scale. It was the exception. It was by no means the rule back in 1962. By the time we get to 2008, fast forwarding another chunk of time, vote by mail is becoming more and more popular. People are coming up with excuses on why they can't be there, because they have to work, or they have pick up the kids from school, or they have a medical emergency, things like that. And it just didn't make sense anymore to limit and try to judge who qualifies as absentee and who doesn't. It became, if you want to vote by mail, you can. And California kind of termed that a permanent vote by mail roster. So when you filling out your voter registration card, you could check the box that just said, for this and all future elections, I want to receive my ballot by mail. And that started in 2008. So a permanent vote by mail or no excuse vote by mail. And that became more and more popular as the years went on. By the time we got to 2018, vote by mail usage in California was 65%. In Butte County, it was even higher than that. We were in the 70s, 71, 72% of people using vote by mail, from those early elections in the 60s where it was under 3%. So really something that became much more popular and was really widely being used by the time we get to the last 10 years. It became a really, really popular way of voting. Another big change around 2018 was the first 5 counties were switching to the Voters' Choice Act. Voters' Choice Act in 2016 sought to modernize elections in California. And how it did that was by giving voters the chance to choose how and when to cast their ballot. It didn't need to be on a Tuesday in November anymore, or on a Tuesday in March or June, or whenever the election was going to take place. You had the option to vote by mail. You had the option to use a ballot drop box if you're in a larger county or somewhere that you couldn't easily get into a polling place or a voter assistance center. And you also had early voting. So early voting being available on Saturdays, Sundays, and this is the current model that we use. So voter assistance centers are going to open starting 10 days before the election, and they'll be open Saturday, Sunday, all the way through the week, Saturday and Sunday again, and then Monday and Tuesday, leading up to Election Day. And Election Day for this presidential primary is going to be on March 5th. But so the 10 days before that, there are in-person voter assistance centers available. And that's just one part of the Voters' Choice Act, being able to really expand that opportunity and the accessibility of the system to all those people. And then the other side of that is that everybody's vote by mail packet, including their voter information guide, is being mailed to them automatically. You don't have to remember to apply for it. You don't have to remember to sign up for a vote by mail list. If you're a new voter, even you haven't done it before, you're still going to get that vote by mail packet in the mail. And then you have your options, the Voters' Choice Act being named so because you do have a choice on how to return those. So returning them in a ballot drop box, returning them by mail with the postage being paid, which was sort of a newer change, not having to go rummage for stamps every election. And then or the in-person opportunities of being able to go to any voter assistance center in the county instead of just your one assigned polling place. Really modernized the way that elections were being done in Butte County. And that started in, like I said, in 2018 with 5 counties. And then in 2020, Butte County joined those original 5 counties. It was Madera, Napa, Nevada, Sacramento, and San Mateo County. And then add Butte County to that list in 2020, where we switched to the Voters' Choice Act, which again means that those packets are automatically being mailed to all of our active registered voters. And then by the time we get to the next year, it had worked so well, particularly through the pandemic that we all experienced in 2020. By 2021, Governor Newsom signed into law the basically making vote by mail universal for everybody. Everybody in California, it would automatically receive their vote by mail ballot in the mail, whether they're a Voters' Choice Act county or not. So Butte County is in that sweet spot where we have all of the options and availability of a Voters' Choice Act county and have the vote by mail portion, whereas some counties are still using the old polling place model and then now are also required to do the automatic vote by mail. California being the 8th state in the United States to adopt that universal vote by mail option while still having in-person opportunities, which not all of those states have. So again, fast forward a year to the general election in 2022, and 87.5% of ballots in California are cast in vote by mail. And in Butte County, that number was up over 96%. So you really see that even when people have the choice of voting in person or voting by mail, that voting by mail is far and away the preferred method of voting. Just being able to get your ballot ahead of time, sit down at your kitchen table, take your time, go through the voter information guide, and really make those decisions, whether you do that with family members, friends, or just yourself, and being able to decide how you want to cast your vote and the best way to represent your interests, and being able to do that and having several weeks to do that is a real asset to voters. Ballots are sent out 29 days before the election. So by the time you receive it, you're probably looking at about 3.5 weeks until Election Day to really decide how you're going to vote, not only the choices you're going to make, but how physically you're going to get that ballot back to us. And then one more sort of innovation on the voting side and how voting happens is a remote accessible vote by mail. Starting in 2015, this is something that the California legislature expressed an interest in. Remote accessible vote by mail, and some of you may be familiar with this because it has been around for a few years now, is an alternative way for us to transmit ballots to voters. Instead of putting a ballot in the mail, mailing it to them having to fill it out physically with a pen and paper and mailing it back to us, remote accessible vote by mail is a way that voters can sign up for the service and they will receive a secure link via email where they can access their ballot, download it onto their personal device, whether that's a computer or a tablet or anything like that. They can make their selections on their ballot, print it out, and then mail it back to us. And the key advantage to that is initially it was used for military. That was kind of what we talked about with vote by mail too, that the innovations are sort of tested out there out of necessity. Because if you're on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific, it's going to be pretty difficult for us to get mail to you and then for you to mail it back in time. But the option was available for us to email it there to really cut that time in half on that transmission. So remote accessible vote by mail started out for military. And then it became apparent that there were far more uses and people that could benefit from remote accessible vote by mail, which we call RAVBM. It's kind of a tortured acronym, but RAVBM, including voters with disabilities. So if you are unable to see, a paper ballot doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. It's difficult for you to cast your vote independently and privately that way. But if you have a personal device in your home, like a screen reader that can read the text on the ballot to you, well, then now we're back in action. Now you can still hear an audio ballot, mark your ballot, print it out, mail it back to us, instead of relying on somebody else to read your ballot or assist you in marking it. You're able to do that on your own. It then worked so well for voters with disabilities, and talking 2018, 2019. By the time you get to 2020 and there's a pandemic, well, there's a lot of people that aren't comfortable, interacting with their mail carriers or going to a voter assistance center, and so it became, well, let's see how this works. Let's allow anybody who wishes to use remote accessible vote by mail to sign up for it. It's not an easier way to vote, and it's definitely not a preferred way to vote for many people because it is a little bit more complicated. There's extra steps, but to have that added accessibility for the people that do need it, especially, like I said, voters with disabilities or members of the military, very appreciated by those individuals. And then anybody else who does wish to use it just out of personal preference is now allowed to do that as well. You don't have to have any sort of a justification, similar to the way vote by mail was rolled out. You had to be military, you had to have a reason, and then it's just for everybody. Same thing with remote accessible vote by mail. It sort of followed that same trend. Military, you needed to have some sort of a disability to be able to use it, and then it was just rolled out to everybody because it just makes sense to treat all voters the same and make elections as accessible as possible based on the personal preference of the voter. So that's where we're at now. We are now, everybody has the option to vote by mail, automatically receiving everything in the mail, but we do still have those in-person opportunities. Those haven't gone away. In fact, they've even expanded. You're not required to go to just that one site on one day. You've got 11 days. You can go to any vote center in the county. The language assistance that's available there in Spanish, Hmong, American Sign Language, it's really, really expanded just in that short period of time. So come a long way. We've come a long way from voting by voice and those party ballots that we started out with 250 years ago. So moving on from the voter experience, or I guess the actual act of voting, is there's a technology element to this as well. And when we talk about voting by voice, those party ballots, there's not a whole lot needed in that. You just have colored sheets of paper, and you have people being able to hear what you're saying, and you have an election. But as the population grew, you have more and more elections, more and more offices appearing on the ballot. That's no longer a viable way of conducting elections. You don't just have 3 people running for office. You've got 15 people running for governor. You've got propositions on the ballot, local school districts, things like that are popping up. And to really handle that load and be able to process those results accurately, in the early 1960s, we start to see machines come into the fold here, particularly in the form of tabulation. You'd have manual machines that are looking at each ballot that goes through there, and they're logging those those numbers as a +1 for each category. So the ballots varied from state to state with these tabulation devices, whether they are the butterfly ballots, they're just the standard punch cards, mark a vote. There was very, very different and varying systems being used across all of the states. And it was really just kind of picking your own poison as the state, based on your resources and your locality, what worked best for you. And everybody kind of went their own way. And it was really the Wild West, so to speak, starting about the 1960s. And that really boiled over the 2000 election. For those of us who may have been voting back then or just paying attention to politics in the early 2000s, Bush v. Gore in the 2000 election really shined a spotlight, particularly on Florida, of we need something else. We can't just rely on these punch cards and a manual count or machines that may not be reliable to conduct elections. It's just not acceptable for it to take that long, and for a national election like that to come down to something like a court case. It really should be the voters, and there shouldn't be any question about the results of an election. And to kind of give a little bit more background on that, what sort of happens with those punch cards, and forgive me if you guys know this stuff, but you used to actually have to punch out the hole, a perforated hole on the ballot to cast your vote. You weren't just filling in an oval, you were punching out the hole, which is fine if the punch is clean and it goes all the way through the card. If it doesn't go all the way through the card, or it damages the ballot in any way, it needs to be counted by hand to be verified. The other problem with those is you run a card with perforations on it through a machine, and the machine might knock out a couple more perforations. So every time you take that stack of cards and recount it and run it through the machine again, you're getting extra votes and more votes for other candidates, because it was knocking more and more of those little perforations out of the ballots every time you handled it and used it and put it back through the machine. So it really made it clear we need more resources in elections, and we need to make sure this is done right. And we need some sort of a minimum standard for how elections are going to be run. We need to have requirements here, and they need to be nationwide. And we really need to get our act together, for lack of a better phrase. So this brings us to 2002. President Bush signs the HAVA Act, or the Help America Vote Act, which did a few things, and this is nationwide. It created provisional voting. So if you were unable to verify, or if your eligibility to vote was unable to be verified, or you showed up at the wrong polling place, or they ran out of ballots or anything like that, there was a provisional sort of safety net where you could still cast a ballot that would still be counted once those issues were able to be cleared up, whether your eligibility needed to be confirmed, it needed to be transferred onto a ballot once those ballots became available. So provisional voting in 2002 is a big thing. Voter identification requirements. Every state had their own way of verifying voters. But once you get to 2002, every state, you need to have a government issued ID. You need to have a social security number. You need to be able to show an ID or a proof of identity the first time you vote. So this is the first time that was standardized across the states. And then the big thing for election officials is funding. 2002, the Help America Vote Act really helped local officials like myself be able to conduct elections with the resources necessary to be able to do those in a secure manner, with the resources needed to not only make them accessible but secure. So very, very big thing. The downside of the Help America Vote Act is now you had this big influx and focus on elections that really had been an afterthought to this point. We just voted on paper once every 4 years, no big deal. But when you start bringing in things like the identification requirements, provisional voting, statewide voter databases, and then the technology and the resources to purchase that technology, there was this sprint towards technology. We got to make this futuristic. We got to get these things going. Cell phones, everybody's more comfortable using technology at those times in the early 2000s. And we ended up with this rush to electronic voting machines, to touch screens, and being able to vote using all of the technology that was available. But then we get scares in the early 2000s of, hey, well, wait a minute. How reliable is this electronic voting that we're using? How reliable are the memory cards and the services? And can those files be corrupted? Now, these were rudimentary early versions, but people were worried they could be hacked. What if you could remotely hack into these things? In the days of early cell phone networks and, wireless internet wasn't even a real conversation. But how do you make sure that these are all real and you don't have real pieces of paper? So what happens to that voter information or those votes if the data drive gets corrupted? What do you do? So in response to those concerns, in 2008, the California Secretary of State, Deborah Bowen, at the time, decertified all electronic voting devices. They were gone. You couldn't use them, and this was right before the 2008 election. So we had all of this money dumped into elections that a lot of local registrars used to buy these touchscreens, and then within 2, 4, 6 years, now all of a sudden you can't use them anymore, and you have to come up with something else. So there was a scramble to figure out how do we recoup some of that investment and make this work on short notice for the 2008 presidential election. And the first solution that was sort of brought up was, okay, well, we'll use the electronic voting devices still, but we're going to have a paper trail. There was a little receipt ticker piece of paper that would be retained within the machine that you could then go back and reference if something happened. It's a nightmare to have to do that. You have to roll out this big long, strip of tape. If you were an election worker at the time, you probably remember seeing those things. Really small print on it, but it was there. It was a physical record that if something happened to the device, you still had a voter verified paper trail. Is what they called it. So that was better than nothing. Since then, California has, in my opinion, come to their senses, and all ballots are on paper always. There's no voting devices in California. There's no voting machines in California. There are actually only 2 states that I'm aware of. I believe it's Mississippi and Louisiana in the country that still use those direct to drive electronic voting machines. So really nationwide, it's become a concerted effort to make sure that we have hard paper ballots that are reliable, that can be audited and counted if something were to happen with a tabulation equipment or just a member of the public requesting a recount. So having those available, and then the audits and automatic things that are in place that we do every election really make it so that we have elections now that are a million times more secure than they were even 10 years ago, much less going back to the 1960s, early 1900s compared to what we were doing before. Having a 1% manual tally that we do after every election, where 1% of the ballots and a sample from every precinct, every contest on the ballot is being counted by hand to make sure that the tabulation equipment is doing it correctly. And then just having everything on paper, it just feels so much better just as a voter experience as well. Being able to take your piece of paper, put it in that envelope, put it in that drop box, put it in the ballot box at the polling place, and knowing that your vote is physically there. There's nothing that's going to happen to it in the meantime. And that's something I do want to explain a little bit further, because you may walk into a voter assistance center if you choose to not vote by mail, and you'll see touchscreen devices there still. Now, those are not voting machines. They are ballot marking devices. So if you walk in there, you'll see anywhere from 3 to 9 of them, depending on what voter assistance center you walk into. And the idea is that they are still providing that sort of remote accessible vote by mail experience where you can get an audio ballot, you can get an audio or a ballot presented to you in black and white, white on black, high contrast, low contrast, large print if needed, that sort of thing. So that way you can make your choices on the screen, and then it will print you out a paper ballot that is then, has your choices marked on it, and then you're putting that paper ballot into the envelope or into the box. And then that is how your vote is actually being counted. It's not being stored or transmitted in any way by those touchscreens. They just simply talk to the printer that's right next to them and print your ballots. That way you can look, make sure it got everything that you picked right. Your write-ins or whatever choices that you are making will all be recorded on there. And then that's what gets counted, and that's what gets kept by our office for 22 months after every election. So I'm not going to get too much into the ballot side of things, just because that's something we're going to cover on Thursday. But if somebody does have a specific question about it, I'd be more than happy to answer those as well. But that's kind of how we got to where we are now. So we have universal vote by mail, we have early voting, and then every vote's cast on paper as we're getting ready to go towards the March 5th election. So one more topic that I want to cover, and I'll try to do this quickly. I know I've been talking to you guys for quite a while now, but so we know that March 5th is coming. On February 5th, the ballots are going to be sent out in the mail to every active registered voter. And what do those ballots look like? What are they going to have on them for a presidential primary? And a presidential primary is unique because it's the only election once every 4 years where your party matters at all. A lot of voters, maybe you included, are really adamant and passionate about their party affiliation, and that's great. It's going to obviously inform who you're voting for, how you're voting on certain things, but it really doesn't matter from an election administration point of view how you register Democrat, Republican, American Independent, Green, whatever you choose. But it does really matter once every 4 years in a presidential primary, because your ballot, if you're registered as a Republican, is going to be different than your ballot if you're registered as a Democrat or Peace and Freedom or a Libertarian, for example. And there's a little bit of history on this too. Back in 1996, California had Proposition 198. And what Proposition 198 did was it tried to allow everybody to vote for whoever they wanted in a presidential primary. You'll have all of the candidates on there. You can pick any one of them that you'd like. And it was a free-for-all. And from a voter perspective, that feels pretty good. Like I can just pick whoever I want. It doesn't matter if they are registered with my party or not. The issue with that is the political parties did not like that very much. And they very quickly got sued by just about everybody for violating the First Amendment right and freedom of association, because the Republicans don't want the Democrats picking their nominee and vice versa. So that made it all the way to the US Supreme Court, where Prop 198 was overturned, 7-2. And 7-2 is a pretty significant result from the US Supreme Court. Usually you get 5-4, 6-3 cases, but a 7-2 is a pretty handily slapped down proposition. So California goes back to the drawing board, trying to improve voter experience, but also being mindful of the wishes of the political parties. So in 2001, we get to what we're using now, which is a modified closed primary. And this is a little bit convoluted, but it is hopefully easier to understand in that it really was a compromise from what we were trying to get the voters anyway in 1996 to what the parties wanted, and then kind of meeting in the middle. So a modified closed primary did a couple things. One, it created no party preference voters. Prior to this, the designation was declined to state, but no party preference is sort of more descriptive. It kind of feels better from a voter perspective if that's how you choose to identify. It's not that you don't want to say what party you're with, it's that you are not affiliated with a political party, and it made that more clear. And then since then, we've obviously seen a jump in those registrations of voters choosing to identify that way. But in addition to creating the no party preference category, you also had the parties themselves could choose whether to close their primary and only allow members from their party to vote in their primary, or to open it up to those no party preference voters. So every 4 years, each of the 6 qualified political parties, so you have American Independent, Democratic, Libertarian, Green, Peace and Freedom, and Republican, they each get to choose once every 4 years whether they want to have that primary open or closed. So in the current election and in the previous one, they all made the same decisions. So American Independent, Democratic, and Libertarian are allowing the modified open primary, and then the Green, Peace and Freedom, and Republican, their primaries are closed. So effectively what that means is if you are registered with one of those parties, you will get a ballot with those candidates on there. But if you're not registered with one of those parties, say you're registered as a no party preference voter, you have a choice to make. You can either get a nonpartisan ballot that will not have the office of the president on it. It'll have everything else, but not the office of the president. Or you can choose to participate in one of the primaries that has been opened to you. So a no party preference voter could choose to vote American Independent, Democratic, or Libertarian, and then get those options on their ballot. I have examples. This is probably not going to come through particularly well on here, but maybe it serves the point. This is a Libertarian ballot from 2020. And you'll see right here, this is the office of the president, these kind of single line. And then below here, you get the more kind of elaborate legislative offices. So you have the president and then the legislative offices. But if you had a no party preference ballot from that same election, you'll see here at the top, it goes straight into the legislative offices. It doesn't have president on here at all. So first time voters who may not have really realized what no party preference was going to mean to them that may come as a shock that they're excited to vote in their first presidential election, and they can't vote for the office of the president. Well, they can, but they do need to take an extra step in that process to avail themselves of the parties that would allow them to do that. One thing we're kind of excited about this year is that the ballot is actually going to have instructions for those voters. So instead of just skipping the office of the president like it's been done in the past, that space on the ballot is going to be allocated to instructions to those voters on, if you wish to vote in an open primary, you can choose to do so. Or if you wish to vote in a closed primary, you'll need to re-register, and you can do that at a voter assistance center. And then you'll be able to vote in those primaries if you do realign yourselves to Greene, Peace and Freedom, or Republican, choosing to vote in those, but you do need to actually go through the step of re-registering to do that. A couple other changes and just kind of ways things are being calculated aside from the office of the president. In 2010, California adopted Proposition 14, which created the top two primary system. And now this more affects, it really affects general election ballots more than it does primary, but I'll talk about it here briefly. Basically what it means is that in a primary, you have everybody from every party who wants to run for either a legislative office or a state office like governor, tax collector, treasurer, things like that, lieutenant governor. All of the party candidates are on there all together. You can pick whichever one you want. And then the top two vote getters, regardless of party preference, go on to the general election. And this is instead of what we had before, where you'd have the top Green candidate, the top Libertarian, the top Democratic, the top Republican all going, or you'd have the top Democrat and the top Republican going. It's just the top two vote getters, regardless of their party affiliation. So when we get to a general election, some voters can be confused on why there's two Democrats or why there's two Republicans or why there's not one of each, or one of all six. It's just not done that way anymore. It's a top two system, which can also create a little bit of an oddity. If anybody remembers the last few elections for U.S. representative for our district, we had Audrey Denny running against Doug LaMalfa, and they were the only two candidates in the primary. Well, they run the primary election, and then state law requires that the top two go to the general. So they were running against each other in the primary, and then running against each other again in the general, just sort of an oddity of the way the law was written. But that's the way that it's required to be done. So if anybody's seen that and wondered why, it's because regardless of how many candidates are in the race, the top two will move on to the general election for those state and legislative offices. And then for local offices, we have yet another way of doing it. For county offices, a majority vote at the primary is sufficient. So it's not a top two go on regardless. If, for example, somebody running for county supervisor, it's a 3-horse race, and somebody gets 52% of the vote, they win. That's it. They move on. If nobody gets over 50% of the vote, say the top vote getter gets 40, the next person down gets 30, the person below them gets 15, you're going to take the 30 and the 40. They are then going to go to the general election and then campaign against each other, just one-on-one, eliminating those lesser candidates or with the lesser vote totals. So that's how county offices work. And then you get down to the municipal, school, and special districts, and you're not going to see those on the primary at all. And the reason for that is they don't have primary elections. You're looking at city council members, school board members, rec district, things like that. They are just elected by a plurality at the general election. And a plurality doesn't mean more than 50%. It just means whoever gets the most wins. So you could have 20 people running for one office. One person gets 18%, and that's more than anybody else. They get elected. And that's how it works for those municipals, elections, schools, and special districts. So a little bit different rules for everybody, kind of a crash course, but that's why you may see some things that don't seem to be consistent from office of the president to those state offices to the local offices. And that's because they're not designed that way. So hopefully that kind of clears that up. If anybody has any questions, looks like we've got a couple in the chat. Maybe Claire can help me out with those, but that's kind of the end of my spiel of talking at you guys. And hopefully we got some questions. I can clarify some things if I went too fast.
Great. Well, there are a couple questions in the chat, and I wrote down a few questions of my own, and
Okay,
one of mine is related to one of the chat questions. So that's helpful. We're all vibing on the same frequency.
Awesome.
So I'm going to start with the first question in the chat, which you may have started to answer, but sort of flew by.
Okay.
My glasses are reflecting. Take them off. Person asks, can I register or change my registration on election day and still cast a vote?
Yeah, absolutely you can. So California, and I didn't quite cover this because it really doesn't have relevance anymore, but there is still technically a close of registration for an election. Technically, it exists and it's in the law. And it's from 14 days all the way up until the election. Voter registration is supposed to be closed, where you can't change your registration as far as your address or your party within that time frame, but you can do it if you go in person. So that's what's called conditional voting, where you are able to go in person. You can change your address, you can change your party, anything that you need to do there, and you can still vote. And it's called conditional voting because the new record that you're creating with your new address or your new party isn't necessarily what's in the system. So we have to take that extra step of verifying that. So your vote will still be counted conditional on us being able to verify your eligibility to vote. So by all means, you can still change your party. I would recommend doing it prior to that 2 week threshold, where that way we can just mail you out the new ballot that matches your new address or your new party affiliation. But if you want to change it after those 2 weeks, you can still do so. You'll just have to do so in person, and that's going to be in our office or at one of the voter assistance centers that's open those 11 days prior to the election.
Great. And I actually had a question, and this is probably answered with that. But I know that for people who are no party preference, you did send out a small card to say, hey, you're no party preference. Why could you mark what party you'd like us to send a ballot for?
That's right.
And there was a time limit on that, say January 2nd. Um, I know of someone who almost didn't answer. It's not me. I'm not doing the this is a question for a friend thing.
Sure.
But I know of someone who almost missed the deadline because they thought it was that card that said, hey, are you still at this address if you're, if
The
you didn't get
residency
this card?
confirmation card. Yeah.
Yeah. And they almost just let that blow by. So if you were such a voter and you
Mhm.
thought this was the residency confirmation card and realized too late that it was not, what's their recourse if they're no party preference and they'd like to vote in a party election?
Yeah. The simple answer is just give our office a call. If you call us 530-552-3400, and we'll get that taken care of for you. That deadline was really for us on our end because we have to print these ballots. They're being printed now to get them all ready and shipped out in time. So if you miss that deadline, maybe you don't get your ballot on the first day that ballots are arriving in people's boxes, just because we've already printed one for you that was a party that you have since changed or no longer wish to receive. So we have to go through the process of removing that ballot from the system, voiding that ballot, creating you a new one, and sending it to you. It's totally fine. You're perfectly allowed to do that. But really, that deadline is more of an administrative one, and it comes from the state level too, because they want to keep track of all the data and how many voters are registered and all of that. But you can certainly still change. Give us a call. We'll get that corrected for you. It may take an extra day or two to get your ballot to you, but absolutely not a problem if you realize that postcard's still sitting on your counter. Just give us a call. We'll help you out and we can get that taken care of.
Great. So our next question that was put in the Q&A is concerning voter ID, and I actually had a clarifying question as well. So I'm going to clarify and then ask their question. So
Okay.
you talked about HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, and
Yeah.
one of their requirements being voter ID. A lot of our attendees and members will be aware of the nationwide controversies over voter ID laws in different states.
Sure.
So this requirement for voter ID, this national act, was that for only if you're voting for the first time?
Right.
Because, yeah,
Yeah, and I'm sorry if and maybe I misstated it. That is not a requirement to vote. That is a requirement to register to vote. So, and it's not, you'll hear people talk about voter ID casually in that what they're saying is they want you to show up, show your physical driver's license, and then get the ballot. That's what some people would call voter ID. The voter ID requirements in the Help America Vote Act are just that if you register to vote and don't provide any identification at all, you just put your name and your address and that's it. You don't give a last four of your social, you don't give a state ID or a driver's license number. Then the first time that you register to vote or the first time you go to vote, your registration is still going to be there, but you have to do something to prove that you're a real person. You haven't just invented this name and this address. So you have to provide proof of your identity, but it's not a physical ID. You have to have a driver's license. It could be a work ID. It could be a utility bill with your name and address on it. Just something that identifies you as a real person. And that's what that's for. So voter ID casually gets thrown around where people, again, want, some people want the driver's license attached to their record or anything like that to vote. HAVA and the voter identification requirements that I'm talking about are when you register or the first time that you vote, you would have to have provided some form of identification, whether that's just writing last four of your social on there or your driver's license number or providing that documentation at the polls like we talked about.
Okay, so the question put in the Q&A was, what if an eligible voter has no ID, can they still vote? And you're saying, yes, if they registered with a valid ID,
right? Yeah, absolutely.
They wouldn't need to.
Yeah, and there is a safety net built into this as well. For the vast majority of voters, they have some sort of an ID. It's a state issued ID or it's a driver's license. That covers just about everybody. For the people that doesn't cover, well, they have a social security number. They can provide the last four digits of their social security number. Now, let's say you are a new citizen and you don't have your social security number issued to you yet, or you don't have a driver's license and you somehow fall outside of those three categories: the state issued ID, the driver's license, or the last four of the social security number. The state will assign you a unique voter ID number and allow you to vote, proving your signing an affidavit to your citizenship. But that's a very, very limited case. And I can't even remember seeing one, to be honest with you, where somebody was unable to provide an ID or a last four of their social. But that safety net does still exist if there's somebody in those tight windows where they just became a new citizen or something to that effect where they don't have it. They are still eligible to vote, and the system has ways for them to do that.
And of course, here in California in Butte County, with voting by mail, you're just dropping off a ballot, so you're not showing an ID. You get your ballot in the mail.
Right, and again, in California, there's no ID requirement to vote, but there's an ID requirement to register to vote.
Right.
So
it's that distinction, registration versus actual voting.
That's right. Yeah, and that's something that's really just kind of gets into the administrative side of things. But if you're an active registered voter, you registered once, and then you probably, if you haven't moved, there's not really any reason for you to bother with it or update it or anything. We'll just keep sending you your ballot every election you vote, and no big deal. Your signature on that vote by mail or your name on that roster on election day is enough to get you through. You don't need to continually remember to bring your ID with you or your social security card or anything like that. If you're an active registered voter, you've already cleared that hurdle and you're good to go.
And my recollection is, even if you've moved, once you, if you get that residency card, say it's forwarded or something like that, or maybe it won't forward it, but person who's at your old address gets it and says, hey, this is yours. You can just say, oh, I'm sending this back. This is my new address. And it's very easy to update that.
Yeah, provide us a notification in writing that you've changed. The other benefits of, I guess, advancements in technology, it's really hard to keep a secret from us if you've moved, because we do get updates from the post office. We get updates from the DMV. So if you've updated your address and you have mail forwarding with the post office, or you have you go update your driver's license at the DMV or your state issued voter ID card, we're going to get that information too, unless you specifically tell them not to give it to us. So yeah, there are other ways to update your address passively, I guess would be a way to say that. But yeah, it's so much easier to register and vote now than it ever was. I remember being in college and just banging my head against the wall trying to figure out, I have to apply for a vote by mail ballot. It's not going to make it in time. How do I register? Did I register? And it was so hard to keep track of all those things. And now it is so easy. And not to say that first time voters don't still have hurdles to cross there, and they could use that education, but it is so much easier than it was even 15, 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I have a couple questions just about the statistics that you said, kind of about here in Butte County.
Sure.
The vote by mail here in Butte County was 96%, which is very impressive.
Yeah.
Does that, so everybody gets mailed a ballot. When you say this vote by mail statistic, does that only include the ballots dropped off to you by the post office, or is that also including Dropbox or dropped off at voter assistance center? What do you
Right.
consider vote by mail?
Yeah. So vote by mail means that they are using the ballot that we've mailed to them. So however they choose to return that ballot, it's still a vote by mail ballot. So it still has a signature on the outside of the envelope. It's still traceable. You can track it through the Where's My Ballot system. And regardless of how that gets returned to us, whether it's in a Dropbox at a voter assistance center, a Dropbox at a library, or the USPS brings it back to us, they're all being cast in the same way. They aren't a walk-in on election day casting a ballot there, or they're not a conditional voter that we talked about where they're changing their registration on the day of and doing it that way. They're not a provisional voter for any other reason. So yeah, it's just if you're using the ballot that we've mailed to you, it's your choice on how you return it, but those are all the same. They're all vote by mail ballots.
Awesome. Okay. That's very interesting. So you're not getting very precious about the mail part of it.
No, it doesn't need to
Yeah.
be. Yeah, it's just that's what the law calls them vote by mail. So that's what I call them.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's just the ballot that was sent to you, the original ballot. If you use that, that's a vote by mail ballot.
Great. So we have a question here, and I've certainly seen this come up in past elections. Can a voter return another family member's ballot envelope in a ballot drop box?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that's if you watch, national headlines, they get all tied up with this in other states. They're so worried about who drops off whose ballot. The way that vote by mail works in California and many Western states who've adopted this is you put your ballot in your envelope, you sign the envelope, and then you return it. That signature on the outside of there says that I am this voter and I have sealed my ballot in here and it is sealed. That makes it back to our office. That vote's going to count. It doesn't matter who brings it back to us. If you give it to the mail carrier to bring it back to us, or you give it to your neighbor to bring it back to us, you've signed it, you've sealed it, and somebody is bringing it back to us. It doesn't matter who it is. Now, there is protections built into that, though, for California voters, where let's say a candidate comes to your door or maybe it's just an activist, somebody in the community who wants to help get out the vote. They show up to your door and say, I'll take your ballot in for you, vote it right now, and I'll make sure, it's the last day, we got to get it in. You can sign the outside of the envelope with their name on it. So that way, if that ends up in I don't know, a PG&E, bill Dropbox or a dumpster somewhere or something like that, it's got that person's name on it that they were responsible for returning your ballot for you and they didn't do that. So I would say that you don't want to ever give your ballot over to somebody else to return for you unless you trust them. And you certainly don't want to give over your blank ballot in an unopened envelope or an unsealed envelope to just have. They're not going to be able to vote it anyway because they don't have your signature. But you're effectively throwing away your right to vote if you do that. That ballot's not going to get counted, but you also don't get to vote. So I certainly wouldn't give your ballot over to anybody you don't trust outside of family members, good friends. But however you feel comfortable in getting your ballot back to us, you can certainly avail yourself of any of those opportunities. And then I would just recommend everybody signs up for the ballot track system or Where's My Ballot, where regardless of how you choose to return your ballot, whether it's through a friend or an intermediary through the post office or in an official ballot drop box, you will get updates when we receive your ballot, when your signature's been verified and that your ballot's been counted or not. And I think that peace of mind is really great. We're up to probably, I haven't seen the numbers recently, it's probably about 35% of our voters are signed up for that. So they're getting those notifications and they can check it. But anybody can check. You can check it. You can spot check it, or you can sign up for the notifications. Just go to buttevotes.net and in the search bar, just type in "Where's my ballot." It'll bring up a link that'll take you to that. And so you kind of have that peace of mind, just like you would if you ordered from package online. You know where it is at all times. It'll come back to us, and then you have that peace of mind knowing your ballot's been counted.
Okay, great. So another attendee has they describe a kind of technical question,
Okay,
which are great.
I will do my
If I
best.
put if I put my ballot in the outside mailbox after the last mail pickup on election day, will it be counted?
It won't. So it's a good question, and we try to get this message out there the best we can. It's difficult for our small office to be the loudest voice in the room on this sort of thing. But your ballot is required to be postmarked on or before election day or in our hands by 8 p.m. on election night. So if you get to a post office box, and they're required to have them, they have the collection times printed on the outside of it. If you arrive at 4:30 and it says last pickup collection was 4 p.m., well, you've got to do something else with that ballot. Putting it in that box is not going to get it back to us in time. But voter assistance centers are going to be open till 8 p.m. You can bring it to any one of those. Any of our official ballot drop boxes are going to be open until 8 p.m. on election night. You can get it into any of those and it'll be good. So definitely when you get to that last day, it is advisable, in my opinion, to get the ballot to us instead of then putting it in the mail and then having it go through the intermediary of the USPS. Not to say anything bad about USPS. They will get that ballot to us, no problem. And it would be, if it was postmarked in time, we would get it and be able to count it. But if it's missing that postmark deadline, it's not being collected by their pickup times, then there's nothing we can do to save that vote. It's going to be too late. So if you're going to mail it, do it early. And actually, that's going to bring me to one other kind of talking point that I want to get to is, and this is something I'll go over on Thursday as well. There's a conceptual idea or rumor out there that vote by mail ballots, do they really get counted, or they only get counted if it matters, from back in the days when not very many people were voting by mail. But obviously with so many people voting by mail, I mean, that's not even a consideration. Every ballot gets counted, whether it matters or not. They're all going to be counted. But the cool thing about the modern vote by mail system is vote by mail ballots are counted first. So if you wait until election day, your ballot's not going to be counted until it physically can get back to our office to be counted. But if you get your ballot in the mail 27 days before the election, turn around and mail it back to us 25 days before the election, we can count that ballot when we receive it. So when you see the results on election night at 8:15, 8:02, whenever they start calling the election, if you want your ballot to be amongst those ballots the media uses to make those projections and those guesses on who they think is going to win based on trends, you have to get your ballot back to us. If you're standing in line at 7:45 on election night waiting to vote, your ballot's not going to be counted by 8:02. It's just not going to happen. So voting by mail and voting by mail early is the best way to make sure that your ballot, one, not only gets back to us because you can track it and know that it got to us, but also seeing your vote and knowing that your vote is in those totals when they announce who the media thinks won and their projections on red states, blue states, or anything like that. You definitely want to make sure you vote early. I'm not saying you need to vote day one because you have decisions to make. You can consider the propositions and candidates and things like that. But definitely voting earlier is going to only benefit the voter for all the reasons I said. You can track your ballot, know it gets to us, and then your ballot will be included earlier on election night. And that helps combat, some people are concerned why it takes so long to count ballots. Well, it's because people are mailing them to us on election day. It takes 2-3 days for the mail to get it to us. Then we have to signature verify them, and then we have to count them. Whereas if those ballots are in our hands, I mean, we could have 100% accurate, complete results if voters just got us the ballots back. So obviously you have the full period of time. You can certainly use that. But that's one of the things that causes a delay in election results, because we physically don't have the ballots in our hands to count them.
And I'll just remind everybody that in your ballot that gets mailed out to you is an official list of voter assistance centers and ballot drop boxes. Yep. So if you're going to use a drop box, check that official list. I don't think we have a fake drop box problem here in Butte County, but it's one of those things you just hear about. So I just tell people, make sure that you're
we're going to send that list to you twice as well. So you're going to get in your voter information guide, you're going to get a list of all the voter assistance centers and all the drop boxes. And then about a week after the ballot arrives, you're going to get another postcard saying, hey, don't forget, we mailed your ballot to you. First of all, did you get it? And make sure you got it. But also, hey, and here's a list of the places you can drop it off. Here's the hours of operation. Here are the addresses. Here are our official drop boxes. And our drop boxes are pretty recognizable. You're not going to miss them. They've got the Butte County seal on them. They say official ballot drop box. They're the ones. But yeah, you'll get that list twice. It'll be in your voter information guide. It'll be on that postcard. And then it's always on our website. You can get it at buttevotes.net if you're concerned or you've lost one of those pieces of literature.
Great. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. I have one question, which may end up being our final one.
Okay.
So if you know, has the Voters' Choice Act increased voter turnout? And I'm sure I've heard this, but I just can't remember. Or I know there's a lot that affects voter turnout.
Yeah.
Um, and it can be very nuanced, but in general, does it seem like both for California and for Butte County, or for you know, the people
Well,
that the counties that participate in it, does it seem to have increased turnout?
yeah, I understand your question. And you're completely right. There's so much more that goes into voter turnout than just the Voters' Choice Act. So it is a variable. But I will say this, when we made the decision to go to the Voters' Choice Act, we saw 5 counties do it first: Madera, Napa, Nevada, Sacramento, and San Mateo. And all 5 of those counties through 2 elections in 2018 were jumping up and down saying, wow, turnout is through the roof. We've had record turnout. And we obviously took that in consideration along with the campfire and everything else that was going on that we were dealing with at the time to say, this is the right move for Butte County at the time, to do that. And then our first 3 elections, the presidential primary in 2020, the presidential general in 2020, and the governor's recall in 2021, all 3 of those set record highs for turnout for Butte County. The highest primary we've ever had, the highest general we've ever had, and the highest special election we've ever had. Now, you had Clinton Trump on the ballot, you had Newsom's recall, you had big things that people cared about, you had a pandemic on, like it was the whole deal. So was the Voters' Choice Act the thing that drove that? Maybe not, but I have to take those 2 elections from those 5 other counties and then our first 3 and come to a conclusion that it had an impact. And I think it did. And to have them just uniformly across the board set records every single time we trotted it out there, I think it's been very successful. And that's really the only way we can measure that an election's successful or not. Because I'm not losing any sleep over which candidate wins or anything like that. What I want to know is that it was accessible, it was secure, voters trusted the process, and they participated in the process. And the only measurable way I can get that is by turnout, right? If you don't trust the elections, you're not going to vote. If it wasn't accessible to you, you're not going to be able to vote. So the more people we can get out of the polls, that's my measure of success. And I think the Voters' Choice Act has done a great job to help us achieve that.
Okay. We do have another question that popped up in Q&A, so I'm going to
Sure.
read that out now. In a previous presidential primary election, a candidate dropped out of the race after ballots were mailed and some voters had submitted their ballot early.
Mm-hmm.
Can early voters get their ballot back?
No, you can't. And it's not because I don't want to give it back to you. It's that we can't physically retrieve your ballot at that point. And the reason for that is, again, going back to the private ballots, the Australian ballots, the secret vote, right? Your name isn't on your ballot at all. So once your ballot is received by us and counted, we don't know which one it is to get it back. We don't know how you voted. So it's not like we can go back and take, I think it was Cory Booker was one of the candidates that dropped out in a previous primary. We can't go say, okay, -1 for him and then +1 to somebody else because we don't know who you voted for. And we can't just take your word for it. So even if the law allowed it, which it doesn't, it's physically impossible for us to get your ballot back out of the system or tell you how you voted. It just doesn't work that way. So in a presidential primary, there is an argument to be made where, hey, maybe I want to wait a little bit longer before I cast my ballot, just to see what happens. But I mean, the only advice I can give to voters is vote for electable candidates, I guess. I mean, that's really the only way that we can be sure, because whether they drop out before our election or they drop out in May or June or July, it, the result's effectively the same. So you're never going to be able to wait long enough to know that your vote matters, because you can get to the, I don't know, the primary in Texas or Minnesota or somewhere else, and then they drop out, and your ballot's still, it's long since been cast. So I would just say, take your time, research the candidates, and you have to be at peace with who you picked. And if they win or lose, you're going to have to live with that, unfortunately.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this crops up a lot when we had a June primary where you
Mm-hmm.
would have on a ballot for a particular political party, and I won't name names, but you'd have all of the presidential candidates,
Even
but
though they
by
may
the
have
time
dropped
it
out.
right, and by the time it got to a June primary, there was a lot of dropping out,
Yeah.
and someone who was clearly going to be the party's nominee, and so I think probably voters felt a little bit backed into a corner because they know these candidates have dropped out, but they're like, but they're on the ballot.
Right. And I'll clarify that a little bit. We're using the word dropped out like it's a real thing. Candidates
Mhm,
are not allowed to drop out. There's no legal method for them to drop out of an election. They can go out in the media and say, I'm dropping out, I'm suspending my campaign, please vote for somebody else.
mhm.
But there's no official way for them to, they are not allowed to remove their name from the ballot. You could have
Okay.
a dead candidate on the ballot. There's no mechanism to remove them legally. So they say dropped out or they're
Mhm.
suspended their campaign or whatever. But that's just them saying it. It's not a real thing. Those votes are still going to count. They're still going to be counted. And if that person wins, they're still the nominee. Like even though they've said they've dropped out, they're all being counted and they could end up being the nominee anyway. So yeah, it's kind of one of those weird things that just because
Yeah.
the way the media and the world we live in reacts to things, but they're still an official candidate and they could still technically win, even though they're actively hurting themselves by saying they've dropped out.
They maybe they should just say, I'm no longer actively campaigning and like you to back
Usually
so
they'll
and
say I'm
so.
suspending my campaign at this time, right?
Right.
Which means they're not collecting any more donations, they're not spending any more money, they're just sitting back and letting it happen, which is really the official, that's what they're doing. They're not dropping out, they're just no longer campaigning.
Gotcha. I do remember, and I don't know what county this was, but there was a bit of a hoopla a couple years ago because a dead candidate did get elected.
It's entirely
And
possible, yeah.
I and it certainly wasn't our county, but I don't remember what county it was, but it made the rounds of news.
Oh, so one more thing in addition to possibly a dead candidate winning, Mickey Mouse and Santa Claus are never going to win. You can write them in all you want. That's not how the write-in process works. You have to vote for a qualified write-in candidate. Writing in your neighbor's dog or something like that is not going to get them elected dog catcher. I mean, that's just not how
Mhm.
it works. But
So
I
who's a qualified write-in? I know it's listed, but just enumerate that for us.
Yeah, so 2 weeks before an election, there's going to be a list of candidates that come out, and effectively, it just means that they applied to be a candidate after the deadline. They met all the qualifications, but they didn't meet the deadline to do so, so their name couldn't be printed on the ballot. So it's an official list. Nobody accidentally becomes a write-in candidate, but at this point, we have no idea who they are. They might not have even filed yet. Um, but there will be an official certified list that'll be available prior to the election. But you can't just think it's a joke and nominate, I don't know, an X or something like that to be tax collector because you think they would be terrible at it. That's just not how it works. But I do get a kick out of how many, Bart Simpsons and Mickey Mouse and all that stuff we get on ballots, but those votes won't be counted.
All right, so attention, everyone! Don't waste your vote on a joke.
Yeah, yeah, don't do that.
Okay, excuse me. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, and I don't have any more questions on my list. So I will encourage people, as space allows, to come to the Thursday program at 4. Oh,
Mhm.
one more question. Hang on.
And I'll say one more thing.
Oh,
If a question pops up and you want to give our office a call and ask, or send it
mhm,
into elections@buttecounty.net, our email address, happy to answer those questions. If you think of one on the way home or waking up in the morning having your coffee and you're like, oh, I want this
yeah.
answer, ask us. We're happy to answer those.
The question that I thought we had was only just someone saying very informative, thank you. So we have had a
Great.
couple of those.
That's
Yeah,
good
so
feedback.
I'm glad people have appreciated it. So anyway, I would say yes, come to the program on Thursday. Some of what Keaton has touched on today will be elaborated on a bit more. Um,
Yeah, and I can show you
uh,
guys the stuff. I'm kind of excited to show off our equipment and our
yeah,
facility. If you guys haven't seen it before, it's really spectacular. So
so being able to see, for example, the nuance between, you mail in your ballot with your signature on the outside of the envelope and then it's counted, but then that envelope goes away, the ballot goes somewhere else, so you can't go and find that person's ballot. So seeing that might help people visualize a little bit.
and I do have a different set of information that I'll share. You're not just going to hear the same stuff. Some
Yep,
of it might be repeated, just incidentally, but it is actually a different program. We'll talk about ballots and how they're processed on Thursday.
perfect. Well, thank you everyone, and have a good night. Thank you so much, Keaton.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody.